This is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, February 7, 2025. I'm your host, Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. What does it mean for a workplace to be truly accommodating for all? How can we advocate for more people-first workplaces? Where are governments and companies failing us, and how can we better protect each other? Labor reporter Gabriela Calugay-Casuga sits down this week with Brad Evoy, the Executive Director of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, to discuss all of this and more. Here is that conversation. Take a listen.
Hi, so thank you so much for joining us on Rabble Radio today, Brad.
Happy to be here.
Could you tell us a bit about yourself and the Disability Justice Network of Ontario?
Absolutely. So my name is Brad Evoy. I'm a member of the Qalipu Mi'kmaq Nation, and I'm the Executive Director at Disability Justice Network of Ontario. DJNO was founded in 2018 with the mission of, ensuring that we have a world where disabled folks are free to be, and for us that extends to, everything from prisoner justice to housing and employment as well.
And so I'm curious, there's recent data that has come out from StatCan saying that disabled youth are twice as likely to not be employed or in education than compared to their able-bodied counterparts. So what is your reaction to this statistic?
Yeah, I think for us, I'm not surprised by it. That's certainly for sure. Because the reality is that, a lot of broader legislation, whether it's on the federal or various provincial levels to support disabled workers, is simply inefficient. Like if we look and drill in on Ontario in particular, the reality is that the employment related pieces of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is practically unenforceable. There are 23 people in this province who do the work of AODA enforcement, and most of them are acting right now. And beyond that, the AODA itself doesn't have a very strong enforcement mechanism. So I think that, when we look at, the broader protections and supports for disabled workers, they're simply underdeveloped and under-resourced within a lot of jurisdictions. So I think that, looking at that and having that understanding and understanding that, mechanisms of accommodation and support within workplaces are really heavily weighted towards employers. The ability for disabled workers to be part of a workforce that's set up against them in that way is always going to be incredibly difficult. And when it comes to education, I think similar pieces exist. It has been a long-standing struggle in various educational institutions to have, accessibility services in universities and colleges and other kind of training areas to be as resourced as they should be. And the fact is that, whether it's on a provincial level or a federal level, we are decades behind where we should be.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting you say that we're kind of decades behind. I'm curious, what would the ideal look like if, a disabled worker or a disabled student were going into an education space or a workplace? What would good legislation look like for these people?
Yeah. And I think, when I think about that, I think that when we look at how accommodations work in a lot of these spaces, the reality is that it's employer and educational institution first. We have to fight out in a lot of cases for our various rights in these spaces. We have to take folks to tribunal. We have to take folks to different areas. And, an employer or an educational institution gets to hide behind the idea that, well, it's just too difficult for us to accommodate you. It's too much. And the reality is it's not. And the fact is that we should have, both government supports to ensure that there's funding to allow for those things to be developed in various sectors and in educational spaces. But also, we need to be holding employers and educational institutions to simply higher standards where there isn't any right now. The reality is that if an employer can make a vague argument, or an educational institution can make a vague argument that supporting disabled youth is too much, they can get away with it, and it's not acceptable. And it's something that, can be taken up, I think, by organizations like ours, by unions, and by other spaces to push for better in things like collective agreements, to push for better in provincial and federal legislation, where honestly these areas are well behind what we need to be.
Yeah, and could we dig a bit more into that? Could you give me an example of times where, someone in a position of power has been like, "Oh, we just can't do this," and how, your organization or anyone you guys are allied with has fought against that?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind with that. Some I won't share just because there's some stuff that we've heard that's ongoing. But I will say, what we often hear is, one, that people will be let go from employment, or put in difficult positions without specific reference to accommodations. They'll find other ways to let people go, and other ways to let people be challenged in that way. And so then people get directed to, either, employment related tribunals or human rights related tribunals. And so I think one of the kind of intersecting problems that comes up, especially on the human rights side of things, is that the tribunal system in a lot of provinces, but in particular Ontario, where we're located, is completely under resourced, and has been chosen to be under resourced by the province. So, like, ultimately, it can take years for things to go through human rights tribunal processes, and it's easier and easier for folks to get dismissed in these processes. So I think, when we look at these kind of spaces, and like how to address any kind of accommodation that comes up through in employment and any kind of broader structure, I think, one, people need to be unionized. That's like a huge, huge protection for folks, as number one. But number two, once they're in that position, real strength has to be put into building out what that looks like in collective agreement language to protect people in an active way. We can't simply keep relying, across sectors on the Human Rights Tribunal to be our way to deal with the intersection of employment and human rights. It simply doesn't work. And it's something that often happens. We definitely know of many folks who've spoken to us about, employment issues where, even in, whether they're ununionized or in unionized environments, where they are in positions where, they then have to all go to the Human Rights Tribunal to deal with an accommodations related issue in a workplace, when it's like this should be dealt with in a way that empowers workers rather than subjects them to 2 to 7 years long of waiting for someone in these spaces to make a decision that ultimately is set up to favor the employer.
Yeah, for sure. And kind of just learning about how long the wait time actually can be, it really puts it into perspective. So it sounds like what's needed for workers here is a more proactive approach rather than reactive, going to the Human Rights Tribunal.
Exactly.
I'm curious, what kind of language would you want to see, or would be helpful in collective agreements? What kind of clauses? What would really benefit workers?
Yeah, I think, number one, I think when we think about this, and this is something we're going to be doing some more research on in the next little while to start working on. We have some projects that are cooking on this, so we're very excited to dive a little more deeply into this in the coming, weeks and months. But I think, a simple thing would be that, having very clear mechanisms for, funding accommodations within your collective agreements. I think that would be in and of itself really important, because, like, at the moment, a lot of that discretion is left to the employer, and that simply doesn't often work. when it comes to a lot of these spaces. They'll rely on some of the basic language of the ESA or the broader Labor Relations Act, and then hand wave to the AODA. Oh, it's like, oh well, we've done an AODA related checklist. We've done an ergonomic, like health and safety related checklist, so we're fine. And like your specific accommodation, well, we'll try, but if it's too burdensome, we'll find a way out of it. And I think like closing that door of what's too burdensome is really important, because ultimately it is the out for employers, and shouldn't be the case that is allowed in how we move forward, both in terms of collective agreements, but also in terms of like how we look at employment as an issue as disabled folks. And I think that like ultimately what it comes down to is that this is part of a much broader kind of perspective in terms of how our social structures are developed, right? We've been existing in a system of 30 years of austerity, 30 years of neoliberalism, and 30 years of direct governmental attacks on disabled folks across the country, and in particular in Ontario, where I'm located. I think that when we think about these kind of spaces, we kind of have to fit the employment and education of disabled folks in this kind of spectrum of government underinvestment in social assistance, government underinvestment and barriers created in housing, and in transit, and in so many other areas. And so when it comes to employment, it's just another area where once again we've seen a system that isn't developed to support disabled workers and disabled people, but instead is meant to support the ruling class.
It's a very unifying kind of issue when you connect it back to these austerity budgets for all of the working class. And so I'm curious, what is the benefit specifically to the ruling class when they put in place these policies? How does it continue to keep all of us down?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that when you have a system where it's so easy to undermine broadly our human rights in the workplace, but also specifically around accommodation, you're in a system where workers are ultimately put more at the control of our employers, rather than actually having a system where worker power can exert and have internal democracy in a workplace, right? If you're under threat to have your accommodations undermined by an employer, you're going to be less likely to also then push for higher wages, to push for greater protections in other ways in the workplace. And ultimately that's fundamentally against the positions that I think we want to see in our broader society. So for me, I think we have to kind of look at all of these pieces in lockstep together, right? Like it's important. It is a workers' issue ultimately for folks to think about social assistance. A strong, robust OW and ODSP system that provides protections to folks also supports workers. A strong system where we talk about accessible and affordable housing, as we've seen, I think, with the broader, many crises around housing across the country. Ultimately those pieces come together. And so I think, when it comes to what employers and what the ruling class are doing here, it's that ultimately it's about one way or another undermining workers' ability to organize together. And I think that's like one of the core areas of this. And relating back to social assistance, because I think this is a really important point too, and it's on a slightly different angle, which is that like so much of the social assistance system is also based on forcing folks who are utilizing social assistance into what used to be called workfare projects. So like looking at like getting folks to work for well under a proper wage, who are utilizing OVSP or OW as employment assistance, as folks like to call it. And there's been a huge transformation of that system in the last couple of years, where the government, particularly in Ontario and in some other jurisdictions, have moved those from public hands, where municipalities often ran a lot of those pieces, to private companies. So essentially, folks who are, ODSP and OW recipients are being encouraged to work to maintain their status on those programs, but then also being paid very, very low and undercutting both their own broader work and enriching these private enterprises that are basically just existing to exploit disabled people. And the same can be said, in some of the existing sheltered workshop systems, where folks are working for pennies to the dollar to continue under these nonprofit enterprises, folks who are disabled who then get pulled into run coffee shops, or in one case, the more famous case from a number of years ago, making poppies for like Remembrance Day and things like that. When it's like the reality is these folks are being paid pennies to do that work. When it's like those are actual wages that people should be paid for and compensated for well. And similarly, I know we've talked a little bit about the anti-carceral work of DJNO, but that also plays into this as well, where prison labor is used across this country and paid incredibly poorly in many cases. So again, all of these pieces really fit well together from a disability justice perspective. I think for us, disability justice often encompasses every piece of these sorts of things together. And so, being able to bring it together is just really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned that DJNO is going to look at doing some more research on these kind of issues, and we also talked about the history of austerity budgets and of neoliberalism that has led us here. So why now? What sparked this project to start to get off the ground now?
Yeah, I think for us, there's a few things. So I think one of the areas that I think we're really interested in, I think similar to what we've been talking about, is looking at building collective agreement language, looking to build supports in these areas, while we also still try to look at broader reform and change to things like the ESA, the AODA, these pieces, or replacement of these legislations in something way better. So I think that we see that definitely as a big gap in terms of broader advocacy that's out there. And I think that being able to move that forward is something that's really a big deal, and really something that would be important for us to more broadly consider. But I think too, looking at it from the perspective of like the holistic perspective of what we're up against, I think also too, it's really important to be able to bring these pieces together. Like we've been kind of saying, it's that, this isn't just about employment or housing or social assistance or transit or any of these pieces in isolation. That ultimately they're all part of one broader system of austerity, of neoliberalism, and ultimately of social murder. Not to get to Friedrich Engels here, but it's like this is very much where we're at in this broader society. And I think more importantly, in a time of a lot of broader instability, whether it's from conservative attacks, either nationally or provincially or what have you, and even looking at the broader international in terms of like the broader instabilities that are spilling out into the wider world, and how far right organizers are organizing all over on the international scale. I think it's really important for us to think about the work that we do and disability justice as one of the possible ways and lenses to really push back against that, right? I think we need to have a clear, progressive vision of what our world could be. And ultimately, going back to like what we were founded to do, DJNO's core mission is all about making a world where disabled people can be, and we can have the lives that we want to have. We can hold people to account, and we can thrive as a community and as various communities. So I guess for me, it comes down to that question of, if we're going to do this kind of work, we have to be ready to take it on whichever angle and aspect we can, and really articulate that whole vision of society. Which is a big task, but it's one that ourselves, and I think a number of other organizations, I think there's a lot of coming to this realization of needing to have that holistic vision.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that also speaks a bit to what we were saying before about how, disability justice issues are also workers' issues, and it kind of unites us all. So thank you so much for that. Just before I end this interview, is there anything else you wanted to add or mention?
Yeah, I would just say, and for folks that are looking at the broader barriers that are out there right now and looking towards this question of agency for, disabled youth, for disabled communities, for adults, for seniors, because there's lots to say about, broader home care and those pieces for youth and seniors and adults, and also workers' rights in those spaces. For folks who are looking for a way to look at the world, to analyze the world, I'd really, really strongly consider and ask folks to consider looking at lenses of disability justice. Everything that we've been talking about and more fits into the kind of framework that we're talking about. And for folks, around the country who are hearing this, I would really, really strongly encourage folks that if you're building organizations and building ways to push back against this international system of austerity, of social murder, of neoliberalism, and of that kind of violence against, predominantly racialized working class. Disability justice is one of the lenses to do that. And I really hope that folks can take that from this, and that we can see a blooming of a lot of organizations with this kind of, look going forward. And, ultimately, we're just looking forward to working with more folks out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Rabble Radio today.
Happy to.
That was Brad Evoy, the Executive Director of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, and Rabble labor reporter Gabriela Calugay-Casuga in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Brad and Gabby. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. Here to bring us up to date is Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. This week in national news, Donald Trump may have put his tariff on Canadian goods on pause earlier this week, but as Rabble parliamentary reporter Carl Nirenberg explains, the threats against Canadian sovereignty remain. Trump may have claimed that the tariffs were about the illegal drug trade and border security, but at the same time he continued to drop hints about annexing Canada as the 51st state. Not only is annexing your neighbors a violation of international law, there are also many areas in which Canada surpasses the United States. Canada has a better life expectancy. We also have better educational and health outcomes. While the wage gap between the very rich and the very poor in Canada is still substantial, it is much less than it is in the United States. 2 days after the tariffs were implemented, Trump announced he was pausing them for 30 days. As Nirenberg writes, this is not the end of the story. Stay tuned to rabble.ca for updates. In electoral news, the group Cooperate for Canada is arguing in favor of strategic voting in this upcoming federal election. In response to an article written for Rabble by Carl Nirenberg against strategic voting, Kathleen O'Hara argues that strategic voting might be the only way to keep Pierre Poilievre from winning the next federal election to be held later this year. O'Hara points to numerous ridings across Canada where the Conservatives won in the last election with less than 40% of the vote. She and Cooperate for Canada are calling on the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens to cooperate in those ridings by only fielding one candidate amongst them to defeat the Conservatives and keep the far-right Poilievre from power. In provincial news, the Ontario Health Coalition is calling out Premier Doug Ford's terrible record on healthcare. In Ontario, emergency rooms in the province were closed for a total of over 14,000 hours in 2024, a new record. Additionally, more than 1 million Ontarians lost their family doctor since Ford was first elected, leaving a total of 2.5 million without a family physician. Ford has also aggressively privatized many aspects of the public healthcare system. The increasing use of private nursing agencies to fill staffing shortages at medical facilities is just one example. The Ontario Health Coalition is warning that another 4 years of Doug Ford could be disastrous for affordable public health care in the province. Also in provincial news, in an exclusive report, Rabble examines the environmental no-go zones that Alberta has put in place, restricting the construction of some energy projects. All of these restrictions seem to apply only to renewable energy projects. Fossil fuel projects are left with far fewer restrictions, and have even had some restrictions lifted in 2024. As of this past December, the province lifted some restrictions on coal mining in the Rocky Mountains. Meanwhile, renewable energy projects not only have to go through stricter environmental impact assessments, but also visual impact assessments. Read the full story on rabble.ca today. And finally, in environmental news, Rabble columnist Ole Henriksen argues that the transformative change needed to protect nature and the climate is a responsibility of every individual, not just governments. Late last year, the UN released a document outlining 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are applicable to all levels of society. Some of the broad goals include, quote, equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human-nature relationships, and adaptive learning and action, end quote. Read his full column to learn more about how you can be a part of the climate solution. And as always, you can read the full version of all the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please rate, review, share Rabble Radio with your friends. It takes 2 seconds to support independent media like Rabble. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Nierenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.